Right, good evening, everyone. Now, before we start, I think there are still a lot of quite a few people jumping onto the Zoom session. So can we just wait another minute or so around that? All right, folks, I suggest that we go ahead. Tina koto katoa. Good afternoon, New Zealand, and I think good afternoon as well, Southeast Asia, for those who are coming from the Southeast Asia region in particular, Malaysia, Andrew Bailey, and so on, and of course, recognizing that President of the ASEAN New Zealand Business Council, Mark Thomas, is also on Zoom as well. Now, welcome everyone to the ABA webinar around the US-China trade and wider implications from ASEAN. It is great to have my friend Stephen Jacobi holding the fort with me on this one. No doubt we'll be passing ball around. I'm always going to say, look, the ball is in your court, Stephen, and I just run along with what he's thinking about. Now, as we know, we have been through this webinar kind of things before, but this is a special one because it's linked back to the New Zealand ASEAN Business Alliance, to which, of course, is critical to think about. That is a network or hub to which we have the New Zealand Chamber of Commerce in the Southeast Asia region as a main conduit for New Zealand in conjunction with the ASEAN New Zealand Business Council as well. So we need to have that webinar because kind of very difficult to have still have everyone traveling for just a 45-minute. I don't think Stephen and I will sort of like become upset because people don't, we don't want people to travel for us for that 45 minutes of conversation within this session. Now, so we have that particular pandemic to which we remember, but we also have these other things that is loitering around there in the background around Russia, Ukraine, and of course is being overtaken a little bit by Taiwan and China. But if you fall back to a lot of the situations that we are facing today, at the backdrop of it is the kind of challenges that we are facing around China and US. Because at the end of the day, I mean, look at the widespread of China and US trade, right? So let's not talk about other elements of it, but only US-China trade. Basically, these two countries on their own are the sort of the largest trading nations to everyone else in the world, literally, right? And that's what we are talking about here. So basically, I think China is probably the largest trading partner to about 123 economies. And basically sort of US has the other 80 over countries as their largest trading partner as well. So I think if you think about the dimensions of whether there's going to conflict between China and US, then it becomes kind of a big situation for everyone, which of course covers Asia and covers ASEAN as well. Right. So nonetheless, it is important to think in that context. And today we have Stephen and myself to run into this session to which we have, sort of like craft some thinking around it. Stephen, take the lead as per what I said, and I will just follow through. Now, in front of us, just before we kick off the session, right, please, can we have actually a quick e-poll whereby there will be 3 questions popping up in your screen now. Hopefully you can do the very quick multiple choice questions in about maybe 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes in front of you, so that we want to know which country your business is located. Now, we also want to know your level of optimism around the future of US-China trade relations, right? Whether it's optimistic or pessimistic or neutral, or you don't care what is going on. But I don't think we have a category called you don't care, but basically, I think you might as well just put it neutral if you don't care at all. And finally, of course, what capacity does ASEAN have to receive investment due to diversification on China? And of course, that question always pops up, like everyone talks about diversification from China, including back here in New Zealand. But of course, we know to diversify away from China, but we don't know where to diversify to, of course, right? And henceforth, Vietnam and a few other countries in Southeast Asia has been proposed to sort of substitute China in that capacity. But what do you think in terms of whether, for those who are familiar with the Southeast Asia region, what do you think whether the Southeast Asia region should be able to pick those up? So right there in front of you, if you can complete it in the next, I guess there's only about 30 seconds left. Okay, without much further ado, shall I introduce our special guest speaker, Stephen Jacobi. And Stephen Jacobi is well known to quite a few walks of life in this webinar. Stephen Jacobi is the Managing Director of Jacobi Consulting. Jacobi Consulting offers advice to business and government clients in the fields of international trade, government relations, and economic development. Stephen Jacobi is also the Executive Director of the New Zealand International Business Forum and serves as alternate New Zealand member for the APEC Business Advisory Council, known as ABAC. Stephen has extensive diplomatic, trade, and government experience, includes posts such as Deputy High Commissioner in Ottawa, Assistant Trade Commissioner in Paris, and advisor on trade and diplomatic issues with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So no doubt in the past, he may have clocked up a lot of air points. He was formerly private secretary to the Minister for Trade Negotiations, advising on trade policy, international affairs, and government-to-government negotiations. Interestingly, this background is something that I really love. Stephen has served as executive director of both the New Zealand-US Council, which is 2005 to 2013, and then subsequently the New Zealand-China Council, 2016 to 2019. So he might be standing in the middle of those two. Both organizations comprise government, business, and community leaders focused on promoting strong and resilient relationships with the US and China, respectively. Stephen, as most of us know, is a frequent media and public commentator on trade and in industry issues. Now, without much further ado, can I introduce and pass it over to Stephen?
Well, kia ora koutou katoa, and kia ora Siah. What a pleasure it is to be able to join you to talk about important issues, particularly with my good friend Siah, who, of course, knows far more about all of this than me. So that ball might be coming back at you, Siah, pretty regularly as we have our discussion. Thanks also to the ASEAN New Zealand Business Council and the ASEAN Business Alliance for bringing us together this evening. This is a very timely discussion. Our friends in ASEAN are worried. They're worried about major power rivalry and the possibility of collateral damage. Now, it was once rightly said, when elephants fight, it gets tough on the grass. When elephants fight, it gets tough on the grass. And maybe Prime Minister Lee of Singapore was thinking about this when he spoke to the Boao Forum in China just recently, when he said any clash between the US and China would have grievous consequences both for themselves and for the world. And maybe Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia was thinking of that too, when speaking at the same forum. He had this to say: rivalry can take on a productive or a destructive tone. Unfettered competition must give way to spirited cooperation. So look, this afternoon, I'd like to examine briefly with you the potential implications for ASEAN of major power rivalry by looking at a few things. Firstly, what is happening between the US and China? Secondly, what are the apparent effects on ASEAN? And thirdly, what does this mean for New Zealand? I'm the trade guy, right? So I'll concentrate primarily on the economic aspects, but it is important to recognize that there are complex political and security considerations in all of this, which need to be borne in mind. Now, I've previously described the relationship between the United States and China as being a complex game of thrones. It's a case of House of Dragon meets House of Eagle. The world's largest economy and the world's second largest economy are increasingly coming to head in a global competition for economic supremacy and influence. At the same time, of course, they maintain the world's largest bilateral economic relationship in terms of trade and investment. Whether they like it or not, they are both partners and competitors. Two-way trade between them is valued at around 700 billion US dollars. There's a stock of two-way investment, which is worth about 160 billion. That's big, with a big impact on the global economic order. Yet the two countries are finding it increasingly difficult to get on in this emerging multipolar world. Now, whether or not bilateral relations between them is at the lowest point ever is really hard to say. Think back, if you will, to the time of the tragic events at Tiananmen Square, or to the height of Trump's not so easy to win trade war. Well, things have moved on beyond the bluff and bluster of the Trump years with a more level-headed administration in Washington, DC. But the problem today is that the trajectory of this relationship seems to be on a downward spiral. The US points, not without justification, to continuing human rights and repression in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and in Hong Kong, to bellicose behavior in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, and to apparent economic coercion in a number of countries. But China points to US rallying democracies in the G7, in the Quad, and now also in AUKUS to seek to contain China. It points to instruments like the CHIPS Act in the United States and its $52 billion worth of subsidies, which seem directed as much to undermining China's economic development. And it points to apparent abandoning of long-held positions related to the One China policy. Throw into that mix the occasional balloon, sharply differing views on Russia's immoral and illegal war in Ukraine, and on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you have a very long list of litanies on both sides. Now, some will argue, of course, that there's not a moral equivalence between the two, between the issues raised by each side. I mean, should human rights abuses bear the same score as an industry subsidy in this Game of Thrones? Well, be that as it may, the worrying thing is that despite a promising discussion between Presidents Biden and Xi in Bali last November, both sides appear far off from finding an effective way of managing these polarized points of difference. And that management is urgently required in order to minimize, where possible, the impact on global security and on global economic activity. There is right now, and let's not be any misapprehensions about this, there is right now a very real risk of a serious miscalculation or even an accident that could have terrifying consequences as each side feels compelled to respond to each other's actions in an effort to have the last word. And even cooperation on something as globally critical as climate change has been impacted. To quote again Prime Minister Lee at Boao, progress on tackling urgent problems such as climate change, energy and food security, and pandemic preparedness has been severely impeded. The bifurcation in technological and economic systems is deepening, and this will impose a huge economic cost on countries, as well as further exacerbate rivalries and frictions. Well, so much for the elephants. How about the rest of us on the grass? Last month, I had the opportunity to spend some time in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, and the theme of today's webinar was very much a hot topic of discussion. What is clear to me is that ASEAN economies and New Zealand share the same concern as we observe anxiously this difficult and degrading situation. We have different histories, of course. Both of us, though, have security interests to protect and economic interests to advance. When it comes to security, ASEAN members have long lived alongside China, and some of them have very difficult territorial disputes to resolve. Even so, China is ASEAN's largest trading partner, while ASEAN is China's third largest trading partner after the EU and the US. Some ASEAN economies are more engaged with trade with China than others, particularly Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, but all the others have sizable relationships. All 10 economies are participants in China's Belt and Road Initiative, with major infrastructural projects underway, further enhancing their integration with China. Now, earlier this year, The Economist magazine sought to coin a new term. They used the term Alt-Asia, to describe a new alternative Asian supply chain, which is evolving as a result of this geopolitical rift. Certainly, the idea that manufacturing would begin to move out of China, most particularly because of rising Chinese production costs, is nothing new. The Trump trade war, the rhetoric about economic decoupling added to this, and COVID, of course, drew attention to the risks of supply chain concentration. But whether Alt-Asia is really a thing is not completely backed up by the evidence. It appears that there has been some movement out of China to Vietnam in particular, with foreign investment to Vietnam growing much faster than the ASEAN average. Some of this foreign investment in Vietnam, of course, is by Chinese companies. Similarly, in Kuala Lumpur, I was told of solar panel manufacturing, which was relocating from China to Malaysia. Now, surveys about the future intentions of American businesses in China also suggest there is planning underway to that end. But the latest AmCham survey from China in 2021, admittedly, before the latest decline in relations, but the last survey suggested that 72% of manufacturers producing in China had no plans to move any production out of China over the next 3 years. Of the remaining 28% that plan to move production, only 2 companies expected to move all of their production out of China in the next 3 years. You may have heard of a speech given in Washington last week by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. It was actually a more positive speech than we've come to hear from the administration about China. But she had this to say. She said that the United States does not seek to decouple our economy from China's. A full separation of our economies would be disastrous for both countries. Rather, we know that the health of the Chinese and US economies is closely linked. So it's worth asking ourselves, if some movement of production from China were to occur, to what extent would ASEAN be the happy recipient of this diverted investment? And there are a few things to think about there. First of all, it's clear that those businesses who are manufacturing for China are more likely to want to stay in China, closer to consumers. And secondly, it's not at all clear that other locations, even in ASEAN, offer the same supply chain ecosystem and the advantages this brings that is existing in China today, even if the costs are rising. And thirdly, and I think this is of particular interest to this group, it is clear that ASEAN has some way to go to make itself a more attractive location for investment by speeding up the process of integration through the ASEAN Economic Community. Some great work is underway, but that is not complete. It involves a mix of policies aimed at deepening ASEAN economies' participation in regional value chains. And as the Malaysian think tank Ideas said to me when I was in Kuala Lumpur, Ideas is a very interesting think tank, and it said that attention is required to regulatory coherence across ASEAN, to addressing non-tariff barriers which penalize intra-ASEAN trade, and liberalizing and improving trade and investment policies. And again, on this topic, Prime Minister Lee had something interesting to say in Boao. He said that one way of mitigating global risks is for countries in Asia to build a dense mesh of cooperation and interdependence. So, when elephants fight, it gets hard on the grass. But will growing thicker grass actually help? Well, not entirely, I'm afraid to say, because mice can still get trampled. The aim surely should be to prevent elephants fighting in the first place. And this is where New Zealand and ASEAN share a fundamental interest. And where we are already engaged in thickening up the ties that bind in the region, especially through these instruments like ANZFTA, RCEP, CPTPP, and even the newish Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the US-led initiative that you'll have heard about. Again, to quote Prime Minister Lee, these groupings are not mutually exclusive. They have varying memberships. They often overlap with one another. Not every country needs to be in every group, but collectively, the different groupings build a resilient and interlocking network of cooperation among countries in Asia. And this gives our external partners a stake in Asia's peace and prosperity. Now, they are very interesting comments. Most particularly, I think the idea that IPEF should be seen as one of another instruments that enable linkages to be made, and the fact that not everybody has to be in everything. That is interesting in itself. But it seems to me also that after 30 years of effort or more, New Zealand is well and truly part of this network of cooperation and can use it to good advantage to navigate our own path through these choppy geopolitical seas. Our high-quality relationships with ASEAN economies can assist in deepening our understanding of change and risk in the region. Our access to ASEAN through an upgraded ANZFTA and a fully implemented RCEP can provide new options for trade and investment. I expect you agree that in some ways we've only scratched the surface of the opportunities that are open to us in ASEAN. We don't need necessarily to look to far off Europe for new opportunities. We have them already on our doorstep. Writing recently about AUKUS in the Australian Foreign Affairs Journal, the legendary Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore had this to say: Australia has no idea what a powerful partner ASEAN could be. Many in Canberra, for example, celebrate Australia's current closeness with Japan in the Quad. Japan's economy was 8 times bigger than ASEAN's in 2020. However, it is now only 1.5 times bigger. By 2030, ASEAN's economy will be bigger than Japan's. Now, those same comments could be applied to New Zealand. And even as we struggle to avoid picking sides in this widening Game of Thrones, we do need to pick our own side and work to expand key relationships with our ASEAN friends. So, Siah, in a increasingly contested global environment where the challenges are greater than any one country, even the larger ones, to solve, there is an urgent need for countries to find what Prime Minister Anwar at Bao called the spirited cooperation. That is true for the United States and China. It is equally true for the rest of us. Now, the future around all of this is very hard to discern, but the way forward needs to be informed by an understanding of what is happening on the ground, especially when that ground is decidedly shaky. That's why this gathering, as I said at the outset, is a very timely one. The ASEAN New Zealand Business Council has long carried the torch of deeper relations between New Zealand and ASEAN economies. And when these global elephants begin to fight, then that deepening of relations with our friends in the region is required more than ever. So, Siah, I'm now looking to some spirited conversation with you. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Stephen. Thank you very much. I think I was waiting for another 5 minutes from you, but never mind. So I can chip in my fair share of 5 minutes. While we are waiting for a few more other questions to come through on the chat now. Can I have Lou to put up the results, because there's been certain mention about it, in your capacity pool. So the first one, in which country your business is located? So New Zealand 80%, Malaysia 10%, Singapore and Vietnam. I think there's a few people who didn't respond to that. So that would be the first question. And do we have the results of the other questions as well, Lou?
Yeah, are you able to scroll down on my page? If I scroll down, I can see the rest.
Okay, I'm not seeing it on my site. Are you able to release the result to me again one more time?
I will try, yeah.
Yep, this time it works. Now, what is the level of optimism? So looks like no one is optimistic at all. So it's very unfortunate what is happening here. Neutral 40%, 45% pessimistic, and 15% very pessimistic. So I think we need some potion from you, Stephen, on some optimism in that space a little bit later on. And finally, what capacity does ASEAN have to receive? High capacity, 30%, some capacity, 60%, and low capacity, 10%. So a little bit lukewarm on that side, not a lot of capacity drilling down to the bottom there. So there's some hesitancy around whether ASEAN can pick up from China or where we start leaving China on that kind of strength. Okay. So now let's hop on to the screen to which Stephen and I can have a conversation around that. Now, I do have a question from Mark Thomas, so I can jump in on that one first, or I wouldn't mind jumping on that one. So, Stephen, how do you think New Zealand businesses looking to invest in ASEAN needs to take the sobering US-China relationship into account?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that, Mark. And I mean, this is the very, complex task that our businesses have. Now they are thinking, when they are thinking about expanding into the region, needing to take account of the sorts of developments that I've talked about. But of course, no one can predict the future. And no one can really say how these things are going to develop. I must admit that my own answer to that poll was somewhat pessimistic, at least in regard to the US and China. I just don't see either of them in the near term moving away from that. But what can New Zealand businesses do? I mean, I think the first thing is that relationships really matter. And a reasonable strategy in the sense of, in the face of unknowns, is that you draw your friends closer to you. So I think New Zealanders looking to go into the region need to pay a lot of attention to the quality of the relations that they have. I mean, this is particularly true, by the way, whether you're trading in China or if you're trading in ASEAN, because the quality of those relationships could help mitigate serious impacts. That's the first thing. I think that also very careful attention to strategy and business plan is going to be required. I mean, this has always been required, right? But those potential risks need at least to be thought about, even if the ways of overcoming them might not be apparent. But it's as well to be advised about what the risks are. And that also stems from working with local partners to understand those dynamics. But I think, New Zealand is, as I was trying to say, I think New Zealand is in a very good position here. We do have 30 years of cooperation with ASEAN economies. If anything, I think we should be taking it up a notch or two, and we should be devoting a lot more attention to that part of the world.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Now, I think I better bring it back and to have a proper conversation with you, between you, the two of us. Now, first thing first, right? So as you can see from the AUKUS to which we are facing now in a mix of things, and of course in the New Zealand news, it's all about Australia, New Zealand with that pact around military and to what extent we are going to get involved. There's also a sense that if you draw back, then there's kind of a challenge out there that if you look at the conversations across the world, it's not just about China versus US, it's about China versus the West, and then East versus West, right? So it becomes almost like a kind of segregation of economies, right? Do you think this will actually become more serious, or do you think that at some point we will just draw back and become a China-US, or do you think that it's more likely that both of them is actually trying to get allies in that process? So do you have a view on where this is going?
Well, I suppose at one level it is natural that in times of difficulty, countries look to their close partners with whom they share values and outlooks and all the rest of it. And of course, there is the element of that in this a growing divide between the West and China, because when you look at the West, you're seeing a lot of old Commonwealth countries joining the United States, but you have also other economies like Japan, like to a certain extent Korea. I mean, you do have more than just the old gang, and I think at all costs we need to avoid that. And you actually even see now too, some European countries taking a rather different view on China in particular. I mean, we had French President Macron recent visit to China and the comments that he made. You had President Lula of Brazil doing the same thing. I think it's probably a lot more dynamic, Siah, but yes, I think there is an element of the liberal democracies lining themselves up. And I think for a small country like New Zealand, we've clearly got strong attachments into that particular group, but we have also other interests that take us in a slightly different direction. And it's about trying to manage those and maintain some sort of independent stance.
Right. China labels this as containment from the US side, but US, of course, says that there's no such thing as containment. It's about disagreement as to how China runs its, sort of like the operation, the governance of the country to become a one-man ruled authoritarian economy, right? So it's kind of like, do you get a sense that is about trade, or do you get a sense that is actually way beyond that? Like, people, sort of the two countries are trying to vie for being number one, or at least one of them feels that they should continue to be number one?
Well, I think it goes much beyond trade, absolutely. I mean, I think that was even the case in the trade war. The famous Trump trade war actually wasn't about trade, really. It was more about influence, strategic positioning, all those sorts of things. And, you can't help but think that the subsidies that are now being arrayed in the United States, which are directed at least partly at China, are there for another sort of purpose, in the sense that the United States wants to maintain its competitive advantage internationally in certain industries. And, that's going to run foul eventually of WTO rules, where it already has in some areas. The United States might not care about that so much these days. And that also has grievous implications for the rest of the world. So I think it is more than about trade. It is about influence. It's about political outlooks. Coming from a liberal democracy like New Zealand, aspects of that are very understandable to us. I mean, New Zealanders are very concerned about human rights, and they are concerned about the way countries behave behind their own borders. Now, China has a different view about those things, and somehow we have to find a way of managing those relations so they don't spill over and make, cause much more difficult impacts.
Yeah, just a quick response from you. Do you see that the potential change of government in the United States in 2024 might change, slightly with the China-US relationship?
Well, I don't think that the last change of government had much change. I mean, there was a change in tone, at least at the beginning. But no, I think these concerns about China now are quite deep-rooted in the United States. And it's going to take I don't know how many years to alter that. And it will be determined primarily about the way China chooses to respond and about the way it, acts in the world.
And on that, decoupling, it's an interesting conversation around all this decoupling and globalization, and so on. I don't know whether you have a perspective on that, to what extent you think one day we will sort of like stop talking about that conversation. In other words, we actually know that decoupling can never happen, or you think that might actually happen and much further down the road, we only discover a little bit much later, so that we all have to start learning multiple languages, multiple cell phones, multiple computers, because you can't log in with your computer if you travel to China nor the States?
Well, I suspect it's going to be a case of both and. I mean, there are going to be elements of decoupling. I mean, very, very, how would one say, very reassuring to hear Janet Yellen say that decoupling's not on the agenda. However, later in that same speech, she did talk about friendshoring, which is a kind of another version of decoupling. I mean, we don't want the world to divide up into different camps. We've seen the difficulties that caused a generation ago in the Cold War. And to a certain extent, decoupling is impossible given the level of integration that already takes place today. That isn't to say, though, that we might be evolving into a different place from where we are now.
And just on decoupling related issue around technology. So we do see that not long after the ChatGPT has been taking up a lot of bandwidth, straight away Baidu responded with their own version of AI. And of course, no doubt we know that China would have a lot of AI technology on its own, right? Is the kind of things that tells us that basically China is now living on the edge around the fact that US will always do anything around the technology to them, so they are trying to sort of create a sort of a parallel space to which they can play around the game. Would that be something that
I think that is a very real possibility, because by and large these developments and innovations and investments of China have followed basically what you'd call, I suppose, an American pattern. But now they are going to be looking to areas where they can carve out, particular capabilities that America itself cannot copy. So I think you're going to see a lot of different innovations in this space. And again, who can predict how this might go in the future? But it's really important that we keep a track of what is happening. And there I come back to our ASEAN friends who have long developed these relationships in China and who can assist us to work out this way forward in the future.
Yeah, and on the related note around intellectual property, so there are, the Americans, they have these foreign direct product rules, right? FDPRS by the Department of Commerce, to which they are not just restricting sales of goods made in the US, but also those using American IPs. Now, what does that mean for Asia economies and ASEAN economies? What does that mean? Because we have been all using US technology all the time.
That's right, and it has particularly strong implications, I would say, and it's a kind of an example of kind of extraterritoriality, if you like, across from the United States, reaching into people's domestic economies. I mean, it is certainly going to have a major impact in the future. And again, we have seen, for example, in a different area, how the application of American sanctions regimes can have on economic relationships. This is not quite the same, but it's another example of how these ideas can, really alter the direction that economic development might take in other economies.
All right, I have probably one last question. We are probably running out of time, but that last question, I think Craig Anderson would have asked in the chat as well, talking about the US currency. So the US currency has been used as weapons, of course, but also for many reasons, such as China holding up to around $3 trillion in their reserves. So nobody wants the US dollars to drop like flies in terms of the value. There's no incentives to do that. But if US was to use that as a weapon, right? Any views on, is that going to be detrimental to the US status in front of so many other economies by using US dollars as a weapon against one country or multiple countries like China and Russia, but at the same time affecting others around the world?
We might get caught in the crossfire, I suppose.
Yeah.
I probably need to leave that to more qualified people from the financial sector to talk about, except to say that it almost seems like our American friends are taking a leaf out of a Chinese book and trying to use currency to affect certain outcomes. I mean, I'm just not qualified to probably answer that question in any detail. Craig probably knows a lot more about it than me.
I guess we could all be in trouble, right? But I think as far as I remember, and Stephen, you and I talked about that the other day, that quite a few countries are now responding by going direct currency exchange. In terms
That's right.
of it's almost using a barter trade version, but of currency rather than barter trade per goods wise or services wise. It becomes a currency. That means I think, for example, don't quote me on this one. For example, Japan and Thailand has an agreement between the two of them, bilateral, so that some of the Japanese goods and services can be paid by Thai baht and vice versa as well. So it's sort of like bypassing the middleman, and that's probably the kind of challenge that businesses might and also some governments might try to maneuver their way on overly reliant on the US dollars, given that it's being weaponized, right?
Well, I mean, I guess what we're seeing in this Game of Thrones at the moment is that all aspects of the relationship between the two countries are being weaponized by either one or the other. And somehow we have to find a way, or encourage them to find a way back to, processes which can not just paper over their differences, which are profound, but can in fact manage them in such a way that the rest of the world doesn't get affected.
So, Stephen, last but not least, do you have a closing remark? For example, what's your crystal ball? What does your crystal ball say?
My crystal ball is that we are going to become a lot closer to ASEAN in years to come, and that we have to do this. And it's not just about diversifying away from China. I don't think the government is trying to tell us, or anybody's trying to tell us, we should sell less to China. We should just be selling more to other people, or doing more business, or engaging more, or investing more, or cooperating more. And ASEAN is a really good partner for us to have, the ASEAN economies. And as I say, we have not yet scratched the surface. So let's get on with it and build those links. And thanks again to the ASEAN New Zealand Business Council, to the Business Alliance, and even Siah to you and the Cape, Southeast Asia Cape, for giving us the tools to do that.
And of course, not forgetting that between New Zealand and ASEAN region, we do have a lot of free trade agreements around, multilateral ones, like the ASEAN Australia New Zealand Free Trade Agreements and FEDA, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Partnership Agreement, and of course the TPP, as well as I remember the ASEAN CER as well, the forum. So there's a lot of kind of the government, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, MFED, has set this up, all this nicely, right? So the question here is how much does the business able to pick up on those things as well, right? So Stephen, so that was your crystal ball for New Zealand. Do you have a crystal ball for ASEAN? Because we do have quite a few people from ASEAN in the region, because they will be sandwiched between China and US big time because of who they are, the potential of who they are.
And where they are. And well, they are, of course, adept at managing those relationships with China, and they will continue to do so. And there will be opportunities arising for them out of that they need to be paying attention to. And I think we can only benefit if we keep very close to them as we move forward.
Yeah, all right, thanks. I think that's all we have time for. So thanks again, Stephen, for sharing your insights at this ABA webinar. Between you and me, we can always talk for another 2 hours on those kind of things, but we'll catch up at some point when I go up to Auckland and so on, so that we can have a further conversation around that. Very quick summary, I think, full of hopes, I would say. Let's be a bit more optimistic. We know they fight each other, but you can also argue that in the globalization that we are seeing, sort of a little bit related to the decoupling between China and US, the other countries are coming together. Right. So when the other countries, 200 other countries are trying to come together and find their allies, one can argue that actually you see a lot more globalization going on there, as opposed to the deglobalization of two economies versus the globalization of 200 economies. But also interestingly, I also want to flag, as what Stephen has mentioned before, that the US-China trade is by no means dropping like flies. So they are actually increasing as we speak, as the two governments fight each other. The typical classic, politics, fight in the next room, and the trade shake hands, in the current room, right? So this is how, that kind of world does matter, which is typical of ASEAN economy, probably quite typical of China, but it will be interesting to see how US comes to grips with that. All right, so with that, thank you everyone for being here as well. Just, presumably you will follow our next webinar series around those topics. Again, thanks, Stephen, right? Thanks everyone from ASEAN and New Zealand as well. I'll see you on in the next webinar that we go online. Thanks, everyone.